Okay, Tony, so we're here in Freetown, Sierra Leone, a place I've been based the last 3.5 years, working for the Tony Blair Institute. And it's a country that you've got a sort of long-standing connection with. Obviously, the Institute's been working here for almost 10 years now. And it was one of the first countries, actually, that you came to start working on effective governance in Africa. And you even were made a traditional chief here in Sierra Leone. So my first question is, what is it like being a chief in Sierra Leone, and what's your experience been over these years?
There is actually a really crazy picture of me in the full Paramount Chief, dress, which fortunately I don't think has surfaced since I look profoundly ridiculous in it. But yeah, no, this has been for me. Obviously, the links to Sierra Leone go back a long way, and because of what happened in government and frankly helping rescue the country from a descent into dictatorship and civil war. So Sierra Leone was always an obvious place for me to start the work I want to do on governance, which is about how, because the difference today is between countries that succeed and fail is the quality of governance, and then the question is how do you get government to become more effective, to be able to get things done for the country, because otherwise you're going to have these great sort of 2030, 2050 vision papers, but they never amount to anything.
And I mean, it's been almost 10 years of this sort of engagement. And what are some examples, I guess, of what's been positive about that experience and the progress that you've seen in that time?
So I think what's positive is that there's no doubt at all that the model that we have as an institute, where you put teams of people in on the ground, I mean, people like yourself who are prepared to come and live and work in the country, live and work alongside the government team. You're therefore transferring a lot of talent and skill and capability. So that model works because what we're doing is we're helping the government the whole time prioritize, then performance manage the delivery of their key priorities, and develop the right sort of rhythm of achievement for a government. Now, here in Sierra Leone, it's been tough at times in the last 10 years. As you know, we went through the Ebola crisis, and I was very proud of the fact our team stayed and worked in the country during that time, as they did in Liberia and Guinea. So the country got knocked a bit off course with that. But you look back over this 10 years, and I can see a lot of change. A lot of change in the infrastructure, roads, port, and so on. Change in the amount of electricity and the connections of people. Change in areas like agriculture and so on. But there are still huge challenges to be done. And I remember when we first came here, the debate within my team was, do we do 2 or 3 years? And I always thought these are kind of like 20, 25, these are 25-year projects. I mean, they're generational projects of change. But the whole point, given this was a country, 20 years ago in a state of civil war, the whole point about this is, you make progress over time, and that is translated into benefits in the lives of people, and in lives saved, actually.
And here, I mean, you mentioned that disruption from Ebola, for example, and we have elections, of course, coming up in Sierra Leone soon, in March next year. We're also in the region, we're waiting for the presidential runoff to be set in Liberia. We've seen the historic election outcome in the Gambia, where we've just been earlier this week. And, we've got new presidents, taking up power in those countries. What sort of advice are you giving to presidents coming in, so that, in advance of elections even, that they're ready from day one?
Yeah.
But also then, how do they get themselves organised to be successful and effective?
And that's really important. I mean, it's just worth saying, though, that in West Africa, there is a good news story in the sense that, I believe the election here will be properly conducted, and that is important. It didn't always used to happen. Likewise in Liberia, I hope we can come through the process okay. The Gambia is an example of a country that, wanted its freedom, and in the end the rest of the region banded together and made sure they got it. So this, things are getting better in the region. So my advice to the new presidents coming in is, understand, campaigning is one thing, governing is another. Okay, campaigning is all about talk, and it's all about grand promises. When you get into government, you're then focusing on actual delivery, and that's much tougher. It requires much more focus, and it requires executive skills, and not what I would call sort of blah blah rhetorical skills. Okay, that's when the hard bit really starts. And the reason I began this whole governance side of the work that we do in the Institute is because of my own experience in government, where I came in after a very strong set of campaigning in 1997, and even though we were, by most comparative standards, quite well prepared for government, we weren't really prepared for the scale of the challenge. And it took me it took me my first term to really understand how I had to get the right policy in place, the right mechanisms of delivery and so on. And we changed a lot of the way the government worked in my second term precisely because of that. And this whole concept of like delivery units to analyze how you implement and performance manage the delivery of priorities. That concept is now used around the world, but we pioneered it precisely because of the challenges of government, I found. So my advice to any president coming into power is work out core priorities, what I call the 4 Ps, okay? You work out core priorities, because you can't do everything. Secondly, you get the right policy in place, because you have good policy and bad policy. You might say you want to change your healthcare system, but the policy you adopt is whether you're going to succeed or not. So get the right policy and learn the lessons from around the world about what works and what doesn't. The third thing is performance management. In other words, keep on it. Make sure you've got a system of tracking so that you understand when the change is happening and when it isn't. Because the system, the civil service will all tell you it's all going fine, and it won't be. So you need to performance manage. And finally, personnel. If you have 3 or 4 good people in a government department, they can transform a government department. If you have a functioning office around the president and decision maker, you can make the whole thing work. If you don't, you'll never make anything work. So, some of the things, as we do with our presidents, so the first thing we do is actually organize their schedule. I was talking to the president of the Gambia a couple of days ago, and he was telling me that they took that advice, and as a result, he actually has time to think and, can plan things, and isn't in meetings until early in the morning, until late at night, just talking.
Exactly. No, and there seems to be more and more recognition of the value of these sort of nuts and bolts, actually, of just how you organise yourself to be effective, and let alone organising, your wider government. So much so, I think we've seen a lot of demand for our services, if you like, of the Tony Blair.
Yeah, we're in 12 countries now. We could be, frankly, in double that number. It's just a question of getting the resource together. And also, by the way, the other thing, the biggest compliment to what we're doing is that you've got a lot of other institutions and private sector companies now trying to offer the same service. So we must be doing something right.
Yes, indeed. And we've seen a lot of growth here in the West Africa region this year with 4 new projects for us. And I'm interested to hear, we've been travelling around the region this week. You've also been in the region several times throughout the year, helping us set up these new projects. What are some of the common sort of themes, if you like, that come out that you see when you visit these countries and meet with the presidents and governments there about what it is, what are the sort of common challenges that they're trying to overcome and that we're supporting them?
I think there's very, very common challenges, and one of the things I'd like to do in time is to develop inside the Institute the ability to say, look, on, for example, electricity generation and distribution connection, what is it that is now clear that works? Okay, how do you put the financing together for power generation projects? Off-grid is now a very, very common thing. So in rural areas, because of solar technology, you don't have to connect people to a grid, which can be incredibly expensive to do in these remote rural areas. But what are the best technologies that are really working in this area? So infrastructure, electricity, roads. If you have the infrastructure, you can do most things. Nowadays, because of technology, if you don't have electricity, then you got nothing. I think there are very basic things around agriculture. Here we are in Sierra Leone, which is a country that's importing food, but it's got incredible arable land, and it only uses 20% of it. So that's very clear too. Then, obviously, things like health and education, for sure, the basic things that you're trying to get right. I think the other big thing for all of these countries, how do you attract investment? And the answer is predictable rules, and you've got to have the basics of the rule of law in place. And many of these countries don't yet, and they need that. So the challenges are very, very common, I think. And, always the difficulty is, I think what you have to do in most of these countries is pretty obvious. The doing it is hard because you're constantly overwhelmed in government by events and by crises that will come, and then you got to manage your politics. And so creating the space to think through the right answer and then creating the mechanisms to deliver it, these are the challenges absolutely common to all the presidents we work with.
And I think this is another theme. The Institute recently published a paper called The Jobs Gap, in which we talk about industrialization in Africa, and that, from our experience to date in the countries that we work in, that actually the best way to create jobs for Africa's sort of fast-growing populations is to repeat the mantra that we have and that you've just outlined earlier about just prioritize, and really focus on an individual sector or even at a firm level, and fix those problems and apply some of these delivery principles.
Yeah, no, for sure. This is, I think what's very clear now, for example, the work we do in Ethiopia around industrial parks and how Ethiopia becomes a sort of, manufacturing hub, this is absolutely clear. By doing that, they're creating tens of thousands of jobs for their people, and they're obviously creating wealth for the country. Then, we were looking earlier today at a program here for rice consumption, where Sierra Leone is actually spending $100 million importing rice into the country in circumstances where it should be growing its own rice. And so sort of import substitution, and what as we saw, what we've done there is use the army, which is a major purchaser of rice, in order to enter into contracts with smallholders and others. So that means that they then have got, they've got jobs, they've got the possibility of expanding their business, and the country isn't bleeding reserves, which it needs. So these things, I think now in jobs, there's no doubt at all you've got to dive down into the sectors you're really going to have to develop, and then focus on them. And again, learn the lessons of what works from different parts of the world. And try and create, which is a real problem for all of these countries, try and get rid of the bureaucracy and corruption that often stands in the way of good investments coming in.
Well, great. Thank you. I think we'll sign off there before we move on to the rest of our day here in Freetown.
Yeah. Well, as you can see, it's a beautiful place with a lot of potential, isn't it? But we're fed up with potential. We want reality.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.